हेलो एवरीवन, वेलकम टू द लाइव सेशन। तो अब हम देखने वाले हैं एनसीईआरटी हिस्ट्री क्लास 10, जिसमें आज हम देखेंगे चैप्टर 8 जो कि है नोबल सोसाइटी एंड हिस्ट्री। तो शुरू करते हैं हमारा आज का चैप्टर। इन द प्रीवियस चैप्टर यू read about the rise of print culture and how new forms of communication reshaped the way people thought about themselves or related to each other. You also saw how print culture created the possibility of new forms of literature. In this chapter, we'll study the history of one such form, the novel, a history that is closely connected to the making of modern ways of thinking. We will first look at the history of the novel in the West and then see how this form developed in some of the regions of India. As you will see, despite the differences, there were many commonalities of focus between novels written in different parts of the world. The rise of the novel. The novel is a modern form of literature. It is born from print, a mechanical invention. We cannot think of the novel without the printed book. In ancient times, you have seen manuscripts were handwritten. They circulated among very few people. In contrast, because of being printed, novels were widely read and became popular very quickly. At this time, big cities like London were growing rapidly and becoming connected to small towns and rural areas through print and improved communications. Novels produced a number of common interests among their scattered and varied readers. As readers were drawn into the story and identified with the lives of fictitious characters, they could think about issues such as relationship between love and marriage, the proper conduct for men and women, and so on. The novel first took firm root in England and France. Novels began to be written from the 17th century, but they really flowered from the 18th century. New groups of lower middle class people, such as shopkeepers and clerks, along with the traditional aristocratic and gentlemanly classes in England and France, now found the new readership for novels. Gentlemanly classes, people who claimed noble by birth and high social position. They were supposed to set the standard for proper behavior. As readership grew, the market for books expanded, the earnings of authors increased. This freed them from financial dependence on the patronage of aristocrats and gave them independence to experiment with different literary styles. Henry Fielding, a novelist of early 18th century, claimed he was the founder of a new province of writing, where he could make his own laws. The novel allowed flexibility in the form of writing. Walter Scott remembered and collected popular Scottish ballads, which he used in his historical novels about the wars between Scottish clans. The epistolary novel, on the other hand, used the private and personal form of letters to tell a story. Epist- Epistolary, written in form of a series of letters, Samuel Richardson's Pamela, written in the 18th century, told much of the story through an exchange of letters between two lovers. These letters tell the reader of the hidden conflicts in the heroine's mind. The publishing market. For a long time, the publishing market excluded the poor. Initially, novels did not come cheap. Henry Fielding's Tom Jones was issued in 6 volumes priced at 3 shillings each, which was more than what a laborer earned in a week. But soon, people had easier access to books with the introduction of circulating libraries in 1740. Technological improvements in printing brought down the price of books, and innovation in marketing led to expanded sales. In France, publishers found that they could make super profits by hiring out novels by the hour. The novel was one of the first mass produced items to be sold. There were several reasons for its popularity. The worlds created by novels were absorbing and believable and seemingly real. While reading, While reading novels, the reader was transported to another person's world and began looking at life as it was experienced by the characters of the novel. Besides, novels allowed individuals the pleasure of reading in private as well as the joy of publicly reading or discussing stories with friends and relatives. In rural areas, people would collect to hear one of them reading a novel aloud, often becoming deeply involved in the lives of the characters. Apparently, a group at Slug in England were very pleased to hear that Pamela, the heroine of Richardson's popular novel, had got married in their village. They rushed out to the parish church and began to ring the church bells. In 1836, a notable event took place when Charles Dickens' Pickwick Papers were serialized in a magazine. Serialized, a format in which the story is published in installments, each part in a new issue of a journal. Magazines were attractive since they were illustrated and cheap. Serialization allowed readers to release the suspense, discuss the characters of a novel, and live for weeks with their stories, like viewers of television shows today. The world of the novel. More than other forms of writings which came before, novels are about ordinary people. They do not focus on the lives of great people or actions that change the destinies of states and empires. Instead, they are about the everyday life of common people. In the 19th century, Europe entered the industrial age. Factories came up, business profits increased, and economy grew. But at the same time, workers faced problems. Cities expanded in an unregulated way and were filled with overworked and underpaid workers. The unemployed poor roamed the streets for jobs, and the homeless were forced to seek shelter in workhouses. The growth of industry was accompanied by an economic philosophy which celebrated the pursuit of profit and undervalued the lives of workers. Deeply critical of these developments, novelists such as Charles Dickens wrote about the terrible effects of industrialization on people's life and characters. His novel Hard Times describes Coketown, a fictitious industrial town, as a grim place full of machinery, smoking chimneys, rivers polluted purple, and buildings that all looked the same. Here, workers are known as hands, as if they had no identity other than as operators of machines. Dickens criticized not just the greed for profits but also the ideas that reduce human beings into simple instruments of production. In other novels too, Dickens focused on the terrible condition of urban life under industrial capitalism. His Oliver Twist is the tale of a poor orphan who lived in a world of petty criminals and beggars. Brought up in a cruel workshop workhouse, Oliver was finally adopted by a wealthy man and lived happily ever after. But not all novels about the lives of the poor gave readers the comfort of a happy ending. Emily Zola's Germinal on the life of a young miner in France explores in harsh detail the grim condition of miners' lives. It ends on a note of despair. The strike the hero leads fails. His co-workers turn against him and hopes are shattered. Community and society. The vast majority of readers of the novel lived in the city. The novel created in them a feeling of connection with the faith of rural communities. The 19th century British novelist Thomas Hardy, for instance, wrote about traditional rural communities of England that were fast vanishing. This was actually a time when large farmers for fenced off land bought machines and employed laborers to produce for the market. The old rural culture with its independent farmers was dying out. We get a sense of this change in Hardy's Mayor of Casterbridge. It is about Michael Henchard, a successful grain merchant who becomes a mayor of the farming town of Casterbridge. He is an independent minded man who follows his own style in conducting business. He can also be both unpredictable, generous, and cruel with his employees. Consequently, he is no match for his manager and rival Donald Fairfree, who runs his business on efficient managerial lines and is well regarded for he is smooth and even tempered with everyone. We can see that Hardy mourns the loss of the more personalized world that is disappearing, even as he is aware of his problem and the advantages of the new order. The novel uses the vernacular, the language that is spoken by common people. Vernacular, the normal spoken form of a language rather than the formal literary form. By coming closer to the different spoken languages of the people, the novel produces the sense of a shared world between diverse people in a nation. Novels also draw from different styles of languages. A novel may take a classical language and combine it with the language of the streets and make them all a part of the vernacular that it uses. Like the nation, the novel brings together many cultures. The new omen. The most exciting element of the novel was the involvement of omen. The 18th century was and 18th century saw the middle classes become more prosperous. Women got more leisure to read as well as write novels, and novels began exploring the world of women, their emotions and identities, their experiences and problems. Many novels were about domestic life, a theme about which women were allowed to speak with authority. They drew upon their experience, wrote about family life, and earned public recognition. The novels of Jane Austen give us a glimpse of the world of women in gentle rural society in early 19th century Britain. They make us think about a society which encouraged women to look for good marriages and find wealthy or proprietor husbands. The first sentence of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice states, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." This observation allows us to see the behavior of the main characters who are preoccupied with marriage and money as typifying Austen's society. But women novelists did not simply popularize the domestic role of women. Often, their novels dealt with women who broke established norms of society before adjusting to them. Such stories allowed women readers to sympathize with rebellious actions. In Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, published in 1847, young Jane is shown as independent and assertive. While girls of her time were expected to be quiet and well behaved, Jane, at the age of 10, protests against the hypocrisy of her elders with startling bluntness. She tells her aunt, who is always unkind to her, "People think you a good woman, but you are bad. You are deceitful. I will never call you aunt as long as I live." Woman novelist George Eliot was the pen name of Mary Ann Evans, a very popular novelist. She believed that novels gave women a special opportunity to express themselves freely. Every woman could see herself as capable of writing fiction. Fiction is a department of literature in which women can, after their kind, fully equal men. No educational restriction can shut women from the materials of fiction, and there is no species of art that is so free from rigid requirements. Novels for the young. Novels for young boys idealized a new type of man, someone who was powerful, assertive, independent, and daring. Most of these novels were full of adventure set in places remote from Europe. The colonizers appear heroic and honorable, confronting native peoples and strange surroundings, adapting to native life as well as changing it, colonizing territories and then developing nations there. Books like R.L. Stevenson's Treasure Island or Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book became great hits. G.A. Henty's historical adventure novels for boys were also widely popular during the height of the British Empire. They aroused the excitement and adventure of conquering strange lands. They were set in Mexico, Alexandria, Siberia, and many other countries. They were always about young boys who witness grand historical events, get involved in some military action, and show what they called English courage. Love stories written for adolescent girls also first became popular in this period, especially in the US, notably Ramona 1884 by Helen Hunt Jackson and a series entitled What Katy Did by Sarah Chancey Woolsey, who wrote under the pen name Susan Colgy. G.A. Henty. In Under Drake's Flag, two young Elizabethan adventurers face their apparently approaching death, but still remember to assert their Englishness. "Well, Ned, we have had more good fortune than we could have expected. We might have been killed on the day when we landed, and we have spent 6 jolly months in wandering together as hunters on the plain. If we must die, let us behave like Englishmen and Christians." Colonialism and after. The novel originated in Europe at the time when it was colonizing the rest of the world. The early novel contributed to the colonialism by making the readers feel they were part of a superior community of fellow colonialists. The hero of Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe is an adventurer and slave trader. Shipwrecked on an island, Crusoe treats colored people not as human beings equal to him, but as inferior creatures. He rescues a native and makes him his slave. He does not ask for his name, but arrogantly gives him the name Friday. But at the time, Crusoe's behavior was not seen as unacceptable or odd, for most writers of the time saw colonialism as natural. Colonized people were seen as primitive and barbaric, less than human, and colonial rule was considered necessary to civilize them, to make them fully human. It was only later in the 20th century that writers like Joseph Conrad wrote novels that showed the darker side of colonial occupation. The colonized, however, believed that the novel allowed them to explore their own identities and problems, their own national concerns. Let us see how the novel became popular in India and what significance it had for society. The novel comes to India. Stories in prose were not new to India. Banavata's Kadambari, written in Sanskrit in the 7th century, is an early example. The Panchatantra is another. There was also a long tradition of prose tales of adventure and heroism in Persian and Urdu known as Dastan. However, these works were not novels as we know them today. The modern novel from form developed in India in the 19th century as Indians became familiar with the Western novel. The development of the vernacular print and a reading public helped in this process. Some of the earliest Indian novels were written in Bengali and Marathi. The earliest novel in Marathi was Padmanji's Yamuna Padyatan, which used a simple style of storytelling to speak about the plight of widows. This was followed by Lakshman Hal- Moreswar Halve's Mukuntamala. This was not a realistic novel. It presented an imaginary romance narrative with a moral purpose. Leading novelist of the 19th century wrote for a cause. Colonial rulers regarded the contemporary culture of India as inferior. On the other hand, Indian novelists wrote to develop a modern literature of the country that could produce a sense of national belonging and cultural equality with their colonial masters. Translations of novels into different regional languages helped to spread the popularity of the novel and stimulated the growth of the novel in new areas. Not all Marathi novels were realistic. Naro Sadasiv Risbat, usually a highly ornamental style. In his Marathi novel Manju Ghosa, this novel was filled with amazing events. Risbat had a reason behind his choice of style. He said, because of our attitude to marriage and for several other reasons, one finds in the lives of the Hindus neither interesting views for nor virtues. If we write about things that we experience daily, there would be nothing enthralling about them. So that if we set out to write an entertaining book, we are forced to take up with the marvelous. The novel in South India. Novels began appearing in South Indian languages during the period of colonial rule. Quite a few early novels came out of attempts to translate English novels into Indian languages. For example, O. Chandu Menon, a sub-judge from Malabar, tried to translate an English novel called Henrietta Temple, written by Benjamin Disraeli, into Malayalam, but he quickly realized that his readers in Kerala were not familiar with the way in which the characters in English novels lived. Their clothes, ways of speaking, and manners were unknown to them. They would find a direct translation of an English novel dreadfully boring, so he gave up this idea and wrote instead a story in Malayalam in the manner of English novel books. This delightful novel, called Indulekha, published in 1889, was the first modern novel in Malayalam. The case of Andhra Pradesh was strikingly similar. Kandukuri Veerasalingam began translating Oliver Goldsmith's Vicar of Wakefield into Telugu. He abandoned this plan for similar reasons and instead wrote an original Telugu novel called Rajasekhara Karitamu in 1878. The novel in Hindi. In the north, Bhattendu Harishchandra, the pioneer of modern Hindi literature, encouraged many members of his circle of poets and writers to recreate and translate novels from other languages. Many novels were actually translated and adapted from English and Bengali under his influence, but the first proper modern novel was written by Srinivas Das of Delhi. Srinivas Das' novel, published in 1882, was titled Pariksha Guru, the Master Examiner. It cautioned young men of well-to-do families against the dangerous influences of bad company and consequent loose morals. Pariksha Guru reflects the inner and outer world of the newly emerging middle classes. The characters in the novel are caught in the difficulty of adapting to colonized society and at the same time preserving their own cultural identity. The world of colonial modernity seems to be both frightening and irresistible to the characters. The novel tries to teach the reader the right way to live and expects all sensible men to be worldly wise and practical, to remain rooted in the values of their own tradition and culture, and to live with dignity and honor. In the novel, we see the characters attempting to bridge two different worlds through their actions. They take to new agricultural technology, modernize trading practices, change the use of Indian languages, making them capable of transmitting both Western sciences and Indian wisdom. The young are urged to cultivate the healthy habit of reading the newspapers. But the novel emphasizes that all this must be achieved without sacrificing the traditional values of the middle class household. With all its good intention, Pariksha Guru could not win many readers, as it was perhaps too moralizing in its style. The writings of Devaki Nandan Khatri created a novel reading public in Hindi. His bestseller Chandrakanta, a romance with dazzling elements of fantasy, is believed to have contributed immensely in populating the Hindi language and the Nagari script among the educated classes of those times. Although it was apparently written purely for the pleasure of reading, this novel also gives some interesting insights into the fears and desires of its reading public. It was with the writing of Prem Chand that the Hindi novel achieved excellence. He began writing in Urdu and then shifted to Hindi, remaining an immensely influential writer in both languages. He drew on the traditional art of Kissa-goi storytelling. Many critics think that his novel Sevasadan, the Abode of Service, published in 1916, lifted the Hindi novel from the realm of fantasy, moralizing, and simple entertainment to a serious reflection on the lives of ordinary people and social issues. Seva Sadan deals mainly with the poor condition of women in society. Issues like child marriage and dowry are woven into the story of the novel. It also tells us the ways in which the Indian upper classes used whatever little opportunities they got from colonial authorities to govern themselves. The novel in Assam. The first novels in Assam were written by missionaries. Two of them were translations of Bengali, including Fulmoni and Karuna. In 1888, Assamese students in Kolkata formed the Asmiya Bhasar Unnati Sadan that brought out a journal called Jonaki. This journal opened up the opportunities the new authors to develop the novel. Rajanikanta Bardoloi wrote the first major historical novel in Assam called Manumati. It is set in the Burmese invasion stories, of which the author had probably heard from old soldiers who had fought in the 1819 campaign. It is a tale of two lovers belonging to two hostile families who were separated by the war and finally reunited. Lakshmanath Beswarapur. He was a doyen of modern Assamese literature. Bhuri Er Sadhu, Grandma's Tales, is among his notable works. He penned the popular song of Assam, O More Apnar Desh, O My Beloved Land. Nobles in Bengal. In the 19th century, the early Bengali nobles lived in two worlds. Many of these nobles were located in the past. Their characters, events, and love stories based on historical events. Another group of nobles depicted the inner world of domestic life in contemporary settings. Domestic nobles frequently dealt with the social problems and romantic relationships between men and women. The old merchant elite of Calcutta patronized public forms of entertainment such as Kabilarai, poetry contest, musical soirees, and dance performance. In contrast, the new Bhadralok found himself at home in the more private world of reading novels. Novels were read individually. They could also be read in select groups. Sometimes the household of the great Bangla novelist Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay would host a jatra in the courtyard where members of the family would be gathered. In Bankim's room, however, a group of literary friends would collect to read, discuss, and judge literary works. Bankim read out Durges Nandini, his first novel, to such a gathering of people who were stunned to realize that Bengali novel had achieved excellence so quickly. Besides the ingenious twists and turns of the plot and suspense, the novel was also released for its language. The prose style became a new object of enjoyment. Initially, the Bengali novel used a colloquial style associated with urban life. It also used Meli, the language associated with women's speech. This style was quickly replaced by Bankim's prose, which was Sanskritized but also contained a more vernacular style. The novel rapidly acquired popularity in Bengal. By the 20th century, the power of telling stories in simple languages made Sarath Chandra Chattopadhyay the most popular novelist in Bengal and probably in the rest of India. The Odia novel. In 1877 to 78, Ramasankar Ray, a dramatist, began serializing the first Odia novel, Sodamani, but he could not complete it. Within 30 years, however, Orissa produced a major novelist in Fakir Mohan Senapati. The title of his novel, Cha Mana Attaguntha, translate, translates as 6 acres and 32 decimals of land. It it announces a new kind of novel that will deal with the question of land and its possessions. It is the story of Ramachandra Mangaraj, a landlord's manager who cheats his idle and drunken master and, and then eyes the plot of fertile land owned by Bhagya and Sarya, a childless weaver couple. Mangaraj fools this couple and puts them into his debt so that he can take over the land. This path-breaking work showed that the novel could make rural issues an important part of urban preoccupations. In writing this novel, Fakir Mohan anticipated a host of writers in Bengal and elsewhere. Nobles in the colonial world. If we follow the history of the noble in different parts of India, we can see many regional peculiarities. But there was also recurring patterns and common concerns. What inspired the authors to write novels? Who read the novels? How did the culture of reading develop? How did the novels grapple with the problems of societal change within a colonial society? What kind of a world did novels open up for the readers? Let us explore some of these questions by focusing primarily on the writings of three authors from different regions: Chandu Menon, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, and Premchand. Uses of the novel. Colonial administrators found vernacular novels a valuable source of information on native life and customs. Such information was useful for them in governing Indian society, with its large variety of communities and castes. As outsiders, the British knew little about life inside Indian households. The new novels in Indian languages often had description of domestic life. They showed how people traced their forms of religious worships, their beliefs and practices, and so on. Some of these books were translated into English, often by British administrators or Christian missionaries. Indians used the novel as a powerful medium to criticize what they considered defects in their society and to suggest remedies. Writers like Virsalingam used the novel mainly to propagate their ideas about society among a wider readership. Novels also helped in establishing a relationship with the past. Many of them told thrilling stories of adventures and intrigues set in the past. Through glorified accounts of the past, these novels helped in creating a sense of national pride among their readers. The message of reforms. Many early novels carried a clear message of social reform. For example, in Indirabai, a Kannada novel written by Gulavadi Venkata Rao in 1899, the heroine is given away in marriage at a very young age to an elderly man. Her husband dies soon after and she is forced to lead the life of a widow, in spite of opposition from her family and society. Indirabai's success in continuing her education. Eventually, she marries again, this time a progressive English educated man. Women's education, the plight of widows, and problems created by the early marriage of girls, all these were important issues for social reforms in Karnataka at that time. At the same time, people from all walks of life could read novels so long as they shared a common language. This helped in creating a sense of collective belonging on the basis of one's language. You would have noticed that people living in different regions speak the same language in different ways. Sometimes they use different words for the same things, sometimes the same word is pronounced differently. With the coming of novels, such variations entered the world of print for the first time. The way characters spoke in a novel began to indicate their region, class, or caste. Thus, novel made their readers familiar with the ways in which people in other parts of the land spoke their language. The most popular historical novelist in Tamil was R. Krishnamurti, who wrote under the pen name Kalki. He was an active participant in the freedom movement and the editor of the widely read Tamil magazines Ananta Viketan and Kalki, written in simple language and full of heroism, adventure, and suspense. Kalki's novel captivated the Tamil reading public of an entire generation. The problems of being the problem of being modern. Although there were about imaginary stories, novels often spoke to readers about the real world. But novels did not always show things exactly as they are in reality. Sometimes they presented a vision of how things ought to be. Social novelists often created heroes and heroines with ideal qualities who their readers could admire and imitate. However, these ideal qualities defined in many novels written during the colonial period, The ideal person successfully deals with one of the central dilemmas faced by colonial subjects: how to be modern without rejecting tradition, how to accept ideas coming from West without losing one's identity. Chandu Menon portrayed Indulekha as a woman of breathtaking beauty, high intellectual abilities, artistic talent, and with an education in English and Sanskrit. Madhavan, the hero of the novel, was also presented in ideal colors. He was a member of the newly English educated class of Nayars from the University of Madras. He was also a first-rate Sanskrit scholar. He dressed in Western clothes, but at the same time he kept a long tuft of hair, according to the Nayar custom. The heroes and heroines in most of the novels were people who lived in the modern world. Thus, they were different from the ideal or mythological characters of the earlier poetic literature of India. Under colonial rule, many of the English educated class found new Western ways of living and thinking attractive, but they also feared that a wholesale adoption of Western values would destroy the traditional way of living. Characters like Indulekha and Madhavan showed readers how Indian and foreign lifestyles could be brought together in an ideal combination. Pleasures of reading. As elsewhere in the world, in India too, the novel became a popular medium of entertainment among the middle class. The circulation of printed books allowed people to amuse themselves in new ways. Picture books, translation from other languages, popular songs, sometimes composed on contemporary events, stories in newspapers and magazines. All this offered new forms of entertainment. Within this new culture of print, novels soon became immensely popular. In Tamil, for example, there was a flood of popular novels in the early decades of the 20th century. Detective and mystery novels often had to be printed again and again to meet the demand of readers. Some of them were reprinted as many as 22 times. The novel also assisted in the spread of silent reading. We are so used to reading in silence that it is difficult for us to think that this practice was not very common in the past. As late as the 19th century and perhaps even in the early 20th century, written texts were often read aloud for several people to hear. Sometimes novels were also read in this way, but in general, novels encouraged reading alone and in silence. Individuals sitting at home or traveling in trains enjoyed them. Even in a crowded room, the novel offered a special world of imagination into which the reader could sleep and be all alone. In this, reading a novel was like daydreaming. Omen and the Novel. Many people got worried about the effects of the novel on readers who were taken away from the real surroundings into an imaginary world where anything could happen. Some of them wrote in newspapers and magazines advising people to stay away from the immoral influence of novels. Women and children were often singled out for such advice. They were seen as easily corruptible. Some parents kept novels in the lofts in their houses, out of their children's reach. Young people often read them in secret. This passion was not limited only to the youth. Older women, some of whom could not read, listened with fascinated attention to popular Tamil novels read out to them by their grandchildren, a nice rehearsal of the familiar grandma's tales. But women did not remain mere readers of stories written by men. Soon they also began to write novels. In some languages, the early creation of women were poems, essays, or autobiographical pieces. In the early decades of the 20th century, women in South India also began writing novels and short stories. A reason for the popularity of novels among women was that it allowed for a new conception of womanhood. Stories of love, which was a staple theme of many novels, showed women who could choose or refuse their partners and relationships. It showed women who could, to some extent, control their lives. Some women authors also wrote about women who changed the world of both men and women. Ruqayya Hussain was a reformer who, after she was widowed, started a girls' school in Calcutta. She wrote a satiric fantasy in English called Sultana's Dream, which shows a topsy-turvy world in which women take the place of men. Her novel Padmark also showed the need for women to reform their condition by their own action. Satire, a form of representation through writing, drawing, painting, etc., that provides a criticism of society in a manner that is witty and clever. Why women should not read novels? Dear children, don't read these novels. Don't even touch them. Your life will be ruined. You will suffer disease and ailments. Why did the good Lord make you? To wither away at a tender age, to suffer in disease, to be despised by your brothers, relatives, and those around you. No, no, you must become mothers. You must lead happy lives. This is the divine purpose. You were born to fulfill this sublime goal. Should you ruin your life by going crazy after despicable novels? It is not surprising that many men were suspicious of women writing novels or reading them. This suspicion cut across communities. Hannah Mullins, a Christian missionary and the author of Karuna O Fulmo Monir Vivaran, repeatedly the first novel in Bengali, tells her readers that she wrote in secret. In the 20th century, Sailabala Ghosh Jaya, a popular novelist, could only write because her husband protected her. As we have seen in the case of the South, women and girls were often discouraged from reading novels. Women with books. These days we can see women in black bordered saris with massive books in their hands, walking inside their houses. Often seeing them with these books in hand, their brothers or husbands are seized with fear in case they are asked for meanings. Caste practices, lower caste and minorities. As you have seen, Indulekha was a love story, but it was also about an issue that was hotly debated at the time when the novel was written. This concerned the marriage practices of upper caste Hindus in Kerala, especially the Namboothiri Brahmins and the Nayars. Nambuthiris were also major landlords in Kerala at the time, and a large section of the Nayars were their tenants. In late 19th century Kerala, a younger generation of English-educated Nayar men who had acquired property and wealth on their own began arguing strongly against Namboothiri alliances with Nayar women. They wanted new laws regarding marriage and property. The story of Indulekha is interesting in the light of these debates. Suri Nambuthiri, the police landlord who comes to marry Indulekha, is the focus of much satire in the novel. The intelligent heroine rejects him and chooses Madhavan, the educated and handsome Nair, as her husband, and the young couple move to Madras, where Madhavan joins the civil service. Suri Nambuthiri, desperate to find a partner for himself, finally marries a poorer relation from the same family and goes away pretending that he has married Indulekha. Chantu Menon clearly wanted his readers to appreciate the new values of his hero and heroine and criticize the ignorance and immorality of Suri Nambutiri. Novels like Indirabai and Indulekha were written by members of the upper caste and were primarily about upper caste characters. But not all novels were of this kind. Putheri Kunjambu, a lower caste writer from North Kerala, wrote a novel called Saraswati Vijayam in 1892, mounting a strong attack on caste oppression. This novel shows a young man from an untouchable caste leaving his village to escape the cruelty of his Brahmin landlord. He converts to Christianity, obtains modern education and returns as the judge in the local court. Meanwhile, the villagers, thinking that the landlord's man had killed him, file a case. At the conclusion of the trial, the judge reveals his true identity, and the Nambutiri repents and reforms his ways. Saraswati Vijayam stresses the importance of education for the upliftment of the lower caste. From the 1920s, in Bengal, to a new kind of novel emerged that depicted the lives of peasants and low caste. Advaita Malla Burman's Tithas Ikti Nadir Nam is an epic about the Mallas, a community of fisher folk who live off fishing in the river Tithas. The novel is about three generations of the Mallas, about their recurring tragedies and the story of Ananta, a child born of parents who were tragically separated after their wedding night. Ananta leaves the community to get educated in the city. The novel describes the community life of the Mallas in great detail. Their Holi and Kali Puja festivals, boat races, Bhatyali songs, their relationship of friendship and animosity with the peasants and the oppression of the upper caste. Slowly, the community breaks up and the Mallas start fighting amongst themselves as new cultural influences from the city start penetrating their lives. The life of the community and that of the river is intimately tied. Their end comes together as the river dries up, the community dies too. While novelists before Burman had featured low caste as their protagonist, Tithas is special because the author is himself from a low caste fisher folk community. Over time, the medium of the novel made room for the experiences of communities that had not received much space in the literary scene earlier. Baikum Muhammad Fasir, for example, was one of the early Muslim writers to gain wide renown as a novelist in Malayalam. Basir had little formal education. Most of his works were based on his own rich personal experience rather than on books from the past. When he was in class 5 at school, Basir left home to take part in the Salt Satyagraha. Later, he spent years wandering in different parts of India and traveling even to Arabia, working in Nasib, living with Sufis and Hindu sannyasis, and training as a wrestler. Basir's short novels and stories were written in the ordinary language of conversation. With wonderful humor, Basir's novels spoke about details from everyday life of Muslim households. He also brought into Malayalam writing themes which were considered very unusual at the time: poverty, insanity, and life in prisons. The Nation and its History. The history written by colonial historians tended to depict Indians as weak, divided, and dependent on the British. These histories could not satisfy the taste of the new Indian administration and intellectuals, nor did the traditional Puranic stories of the past, peopled by gods and demons filled with the fantastic and the supernatural, seem convincing to those educated and working under the English system. Such minds wanted a new view of the past that would show that Indians could be independent minded and had been so in the history. The Nobel provided a solution. In it, the nation could be imagined in a past that also featured historical characters, places, events, and dates. In Bengal, many historical novels were about Marathas and Rajputs. These novels produce a sense of a pan Indian belonging. They imagined the nation to be full of adventure, heroism, romance, and sacrifice, qualities that could not be found in the offices and streets of the 19th century world. The novel allowed the colonized to give shape to their desires. Buddhadev Mukhopadhyay's Anguria Binmo was the first historical novel written in Bengal. Its hero Shivaji engages in many battles against a clever and treacherous Aurangzeb. Man Singh pursued Shivaji to make peace with Aurangzeb. Realizing that Aurangzeb intended to confine him as a house prisoner, Shivaji escapes and returns to battle. What gives him courage and tenacity is his belief that he is a nationalist fighting for the freedom of Hindus. The imagined nation of the novel was so powerful that it could inspire actual political movements. Bankim's Anandmat is a novel about a secret Hindu militia that fights Muslims to establish a Hindu kingdom. It was a novel that inspired many kinds of freedom fighters. Many of these novels also reveal the problems of thinking about the nation. Was India to be a nation of only a single religious community who had natural claims to belong to the nation? The novel and nation making. Imagining a heroic past was one way in which the novel helped in popularizing the sense of belonging to a common nation. Another Another way was to include various classes in the novel so that they could be seen to belong to a shared world. Premchand's novels, for instance, are filled with all kinds of powerful characters drawn from all levels of society. In his novels, you meet aristocrats and landlords, middle level peasants and landless laborers, middle class professionals, and people from the margins of society. The women characters are strong individuals, especially those who come from the lower classes and are not modernized. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Premchand rejected the nostalgic obsession with ancient history. Instead, his novels look towards the future without forgetting the importance of the past. Drawn from various strata of society, Premchand's characters create a community based on democratic values. The central character of his novel Rangabhumi, the arena, Surdas, is a visually impaired beggar from a so-called untouchable caste. The very act of choosing such a person as the hero of a novel is significant. It makes the lives of the most oppressed section of society as worthy of literary reflection. We see Surdas struggling against the forcible takeover of his land for establishing a tobacco factory. As we read the story, we wonder about industrialization and its impact on society and people. Who does it serve? Must other ways of living be sacrificed for it? The story of Surdas was inspired by Gandhi's personality and ideas. Godan, the Gift of Cow. Godan, the Gift of Cow, published in 1936, remains Premchand's best-known work. It is an epic of the Indian peasantry. The novel tells the moving story of Hori and his wife Dhanya, a peasant couple, landlords, moneylenders, priests, and colonial bureaucrats, all those who hold power in society, form a network of oppression, rob their land, and make them into landless laborers. Yet Hori and Dhanya retain their dignity to the end. Rabindranath Tagore developed the Bengali novel after Bankim's death. His early novels are historical. He later shifted to writing stories about domestic relationships. He was mainly preoccupied with the condition of women and nationalism. Both concerns are featured in Ghare Bear, translated in 1919 as The Home and the World. The story is about Vimla, the wife of Nicholas, a liberal landlord who believes that he can save his country by patiently bettering the lives of its poor and marginal sections. But Vimla is attracted to Sandeep, her husband's friend, and a firebrand extremist. Sandeep is so completely dedicated to throwing out the British that he does not mind if the poor, low caste suffer and Muslims are made to feel like outsiders. By becoming a part of Sandeep's group, Vimla gets a sense of self-worth and self-esteem. Rabindranath also shows the contradictory effects of nationalist involvement for women. Vimla may be admired by the young males of the group, but she cannot influence their decisions. Indeed, she is used by Sandeep to acquire funds for the movement. Tagore's novels are striking because they make us rethink both man-woman relationships and nationalism. Conclusion. We have seen how over the course of its history in both the West and in India, the novel became part of the lives of different sections of people. Developments in print technologies allowed the novel to break out of a small circle of readers and introduced fresh ways of reading. But through their stories, novels have also shown a capacity to include and focus on the lives of those who were not often known to literate and middle class circles. We have seen some examples of this in Premchand, but they are equally present in the works of other novelists. Bringing together people from varied backgrounds produces a sense of shared community. The most notable form of this community is the nation. Equally significant is the fact that by bringing in both the powerful and the marginal peoples and cultures, the novel throws up many questions about the nature of these communities. We can say then that novels produce a sense of sharing and promote an understanding of different people, different values, and different communities. At the same time, they explore how different groups begin to question or reflect upon their own identities. तो ये है इस चैप्टर का एक्सरसाइज और ये इस बुक का लास्ट चैप्टर था। तो हमारा क्लास 11 का हिस्ट्री बुक क्लास 10 का हिस्ट्री बुक कंप्लीट हो चुका है। और अगर आप चैनल पर नए हैं तो चैनल को सब्सक्राइब कर दीजिए और नोटिफिकेशन आइकन पर क्लिक कर दीजिए ताकि आप डेली लाइव क्लास ज्वाइन कर सकें। और अगर आपको वीडियो अच्छा लगे तो लाइक कर दीजिए, साथ ही अपने दोस्तों के साथ शेयर कर दीजिए ताकि उन्हें भी हेल्प हो सके। तो हमारा ये सेशन यहीं तक था। थैंक यू, थैंक्स फॉर ज्वाइनिंग।